What would you do if you discovered that your hardest working employee was slowly starving? Not struggling a little bit, not just tight on money, actually starving. Today, I want to tell you a story that will change how you see the people around you. It's about a CEO who thought he knew his business inside and out, until one night, one simple request opened his eyes to a truth that would shake him to his core. Picture this. It's late at night in downtown Chicago. The city lights are twinkling through the windows of a corner office on the 40th floor. Most people have gone home hours ago, but David Harrison is still there. He's the CEO of a successful restaurant chain, the kind of man who built his empire on efficiency and results. David has read thousands of employee requests over the years. Schedule changes, payroll questions, time-off requests. All routine stuff. All predictable. But tonight, as he sits in his quiet office, scrolling through his emails after the last board member has left, something catches his eye. It's a message from Emma Rodriguez. She's a line cook, been with the company for just over a year. And her request? It's so simple it almost seems silly. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? Now, you might be thinking, what's strange about that? But David frowned. See, most employees don't formally request leftover food. If they want extra, they usually just ask a manager in person or quietly grab something before they leave. So why did Emma feel the need to ask officially? In writing, this wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even a demand. It was just simple. Almost too simple. And something about it stuck with David in a way he couldn't explain. So what does David do? He types Emma's name into the company system, pulling up her profile. And here's what he finds, 24 years old. No spouse listed. And here's the part that really caught his attention, no emergency contacts on file. Not one. That's odd, right? Most people have someone. A friend, a family member, somebody they trust enough to call in an emergency. But Emma? Nobody. Her work record, though? Perfect. No complaints. No absences. Always clocked in on time. Always clocked out last. She was the kind of employee every manager dreams of having. But David wasn't the type to get sentimental about employee concerns. He was a CEO, after all. His job was to keep the company running, not get involved in personal matters. He had spreadsheets to review, strategies to plan, profits to protect. But this message, this request, it wouldn't leave him alone. Maybe Emma was just being frugal, he thought. Maybe she didn't want to spend money on food if she didn't have to. A lot of people struggle, even good people working for good companies. But there was something in the way she phrased it. Something that made it sound like she wasn't just trying to save money. She needed that food. And for the first time in a long time, David felt a pull of curiosity he couldn't shake. He glanced at the clock on his computer. 10:47 p.m. Emma's shift ended at 11. And without really thinking about it, without planning it, David grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed toward the back exit of the building. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He couldn't even explain to himself why he was doing this. But something in his gut told him he had to find out. He had to know. David had no idea that what he was about to see would change everything. The cool night air hit David's face as he stepped outside. The parking lot was mostly empty now. Just a few cars belonging to the late-night workers finishing their shifts. Across the lot, through the kitchen's back door, he could see Emma. She was wiping down the last of the counters, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, strands sticking to her forehead from the long hours under the heat of the grills. She moved quickly but not rushed. Methodically, like someone who had done this exact routine 1,000 times before. A manager walked by and handed her a brown paper bag. That must be the food she requested. Emma thanked him with a small nod and tucked the bag carefully under her arm, like it was precious cargo. David watched as she untied her apron, folded it neatly. Even exhausted, she was organized, and grabbed her worn-out backpack from a hook by the door. Then, without hesitation, she stepped out into the night and started walking toward the bus stop down the street. The bus stop. David paused. He had spent years at the top of this company. Private cars, first-class flights, executive parking spaces. The idea of taking public transportation after working a 16-hour shift? He had never once experienced it. He couldn't even imagine it. And that thought, that realization of how different their worlds were, was enough to push him forward. David climbed into his black sedan, but he didn't start the engine right away. He waited. Through his windshield, he could see Emma standing under the flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting from foot to foot. The bus was late. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance. Emma stepped onto the bus, barely looking up, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. And David? David made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He followed. The bus ride was long. Longer than David ever expected. At every stop, he expected Emma to get off, but she didn't. The further they went, the more unfamiliar the streets became to him. They started in the heart of Chicago, passing the bright lights of downtown, the trendy restaurants where David often had business dinners, the high-rise apartments where his executives lived. But slowly, gradually, that world disappeared in his rearview mirror. The street lights grew sparser. The storefronts turned into boarded-up buildings. Trendy cafes became empty lots surrounded by chain-link fences. This was a side of the city David had driven past, but never really seen. David checked the time on his dashboard. 12:22 a.m. They'd been traveling for over an hour. His back was starting to ache just from sitting in his comfortable leather seat. He couldn't imagine how Emma felt, standing and working all day, then sitting on that hard bus seat for this long journey home. Then finally, Emma pulled the yellow cord, signaling her stop. David kept his distance, parking at the far end of the street as Emma stepped off the bus. She walked with purpose, never slowing down, never looking around. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, exactly, but it wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be alone at night either. David followed slowly in his car, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention. Emma turned a corner, disappeared behind a row of parked cars, and then, David's breath caught in his throat. Not an apartment building. Not even a small house. A trailer. Emma stepped up to the door of a rundown trailer that looked like it was barely holding itself together. The siding was stained and dented. The windows were covered with thin curtains. A single, weak light flickered on inside, casting long shadows against those curtains. David sat in his car, stunned. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't what he expected at all. Emma had worked for his company for over a year. She wasn't making minimum wage. This was a good company with decent pay. She worked full-time, often double shifts. That should have been enough to afford at least a small apartment, shouldn't it? But here she was, living in a trailer that looked like it might fall apart in the next strong wind. David leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the thin walls and cheap curtains, he could see movement inside. Shadows. Voices. And what he saw next, what he witnessed in that moment, would break his heart completely. Because Emma wasn't living alone. And the truth about why she needed that leftover food was about to reveal a level of sacrifice that would change David's understanding of what it really means to take care of the people who work for you. David sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at that trailer. The weak light inside flickered against thin curtains. He could hear muffled voices, see shadows moving around. His heart was beating faster than usual, though he couldn't quite explain why. Then the door opened wider as Emma stepped fully inside, and David's world tilted. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows inside that cramped trailer. Children. They rushed toward Emma, little arms wrapping around her waist before she'd even had a chance to set down that precious brown paper bag of leftover food. Children. David squinted through the darkness, trying to process what he was seeing. These weren't teenagers. These were young kids. Maybe 6, 8, and 10 years old. And they were hugging Emma like they hadn't seen her in days, even though it was past midnight on a school night. But they weren't Emma's children. She was only 24. These had to be siblings? Then an older woman appeared. Frail, moving slowly, her gray hair catching the dim light from overhead. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands shaky as she reached out to steady herself against the wall. A grandmother. David's chest tightened as the picture became clear. This wasn't just Emma struggling to make ends meet. This was a whole family. A grandmother who probably couldn't work anymore. 3 young children who depended on someone to feed them, clothe them, keep them safe. And Emma, 24-year-old Emma, was carrying all of it on her shoulders. David watched through the window as Emma gently helped the elderly woman into a rickety chair. The grandmother's movements were slow, careful, like someone dealing with pain that never quite goes away. Then Emma turned to that brown paper bag on the counter. The leftover food from the restaurant. The food she had formally requested permission to take home. She unpacked it carefully, like she was handling something precious. Because to this family it was. David counted as Emma divided the food. 4 plates. She set out 4 plates on that tiny wobbly table. 4 plates. Not 5. The children dug in immediately, eating quickly, hungrily, like they were used to meals being small and uncertain. The grandmother ate slower, her shaky hands making it difficult to lift the fork to her lips, but she smiled as she ate, grateful for every bite. And Emma sat down with them. She smiled as she listened to the kids talk between bites, her tired eyes soft with affection for these children, who clearly meant everything to her. She looked happy, or at least, she was trying to look happy, but David could see the truth. Emma had food on her plate, yes, but she wasn't eating it. She was cutting it into smaller pieces, moving it around with her fork, nodding and laughing when the kids told her about their day. But never, not once, did she take a bite. She was pretending to eat, so her family wouldn't worry about her. David felt sick. Then the oldest child, a boy who looked about 10, asked a question that made David's heart break completely. "Did you eat at work today?" David watched Emma's face carefully. For just a split second, he saw something flicker across her expression. Not quite panic, but hesitation. The tiniest moment where her smile faltered before she forced it back into place. "Yeah," she lied, her voice steady and warm. "I had something earlier." The boy stared at her for a moment, and David could tell he wasn't completely convinced. But he was just a kid. What could he do? So he nodded and went back to his food, trusting the adult who had never let him down before. David leaned back in his seat, feeling like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. This wasn't just Emma skipping dinner tonight. This was a pattern. She had probably been doing this for weeks, maybe months. Getting up every morning, going to work, staying late, coming home with just enough food to make sure her family didn't go hungry. Even if that meant she did. As the meal ended, David watched the children yawn and stretch, making their way toward a small area in the back of the trailer that was sectioned off with a curtain. The grandmother moved slowly toward what looked like an old recliner instead of a bed. And then David saw something that made his stomach turn. A thin mattress, barely more than a camping pad, tucked into the corner near the kitchen. A single blanket folded neatly at the edge. That was Emma's bed. After working 16-hour shifts. After standing on her feet all day in front of hot grills. After serving meals to customers, cleaning equipment, and making the long journey home on public transportation. This is where Emma laid her head at night. Not a bedroom. Not even a couch. A mattress on the floor. David thought about his own dinner that night. A perfectly prepared steak at a restaurant that cost more than Emma probably made in 2 days. A meal he hadn't even finished because he was too busy checking emails to appreciate it. He thought about his office. So large it had its own coffee machine and leather chairs that cost more than this entire trailer was worth. He thought about the corporate retreats, the bonuses, the company cars, all the waste he saw every day in his business. Food thrown away at the end of every shift. Food that could have fed families like Emma's. David didn't go home that night. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in his car until the lights in the trailer went out, then kept sitting there, staring at that broken-down home while his mind raced. How had he missed this? How many other employees were just like Emma, silently struggling, showing up to work with smiles while their stomachs were empty? He thought about all the times he'd sat in meetings where executives talked about employee satisfaction and fair wages. All the reports that said everything was fine, everyone was taken care of, but nobody had ever really looked. Not really. By the time the sun started to rise, David had made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He didn't hesitate before pressing call, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir? It's early. Everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the person responsible for overseeing all the company's employee programs. "No," David said, his voice firm and clear. "Everything is not okay." "What do you mean?" David looked at the trailer one last time, at the place where his hardest working employee lived, where she sacrificed her own meals so her family could survive. "We need to fix this," he said. "All of it. First thing this morning." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up. Because this wasn't a discussion. This was a decision. By 9 a.m., David was in his office, but he wasn't the same CEO who had left the night before. He called meeting after meeting. Policy review after policy review. By noon, things were already changing. Leftover food? No longer just available if you asked quietly. Now it would be packaged and distributed daily to any employee who needed it. No questions asked. No shame attached. Wages? Every single salary was being reviewed and adjusted. No full-time employee would ever have to choose between rent and food again. Not on his watch. Emergency assistance? A whole new program launched that same week, providing immediate financial help for employees facing hardships. But for Emma specifically, David had something special in mind. The next day, Emma walked into work like any other day. She tied on her apron, said hello to her co-workers, and started prepping for the lunch rush. Just another day in what had been a very difficult year, until her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Emma's hands shook a little as she opened it. Inside was a letter explaining a significant raise, not just a small bump, but a real, life-changing increase. Enough to move her family out of that trailer and into a proper apartment. Enough to buy groceries without counting every penny. Enough to let her eat dinner with her family instead of pretending. For the first time in a very long time, Emma didn't have to choose between her own well-being and taking care of the people she loved. But David didn't stop there. He implemented these changes company-wide. Every location, every employee, because he realized that if Emma was struggling in silence, others probably were too. And he was right. Over the following weeks, dozens of employees came forward, thanking the company for the new programs, for the wage increases, for finally seeing them as whole human beings instead of just workers. David had walked into his office that morning as a CEO focused on profits and efficiency. He walked out as a leader who understood his real responsibility to the people who made his success possible. And Emma, she finally stopped pretending everything was okay. Because for the first time in a long time, it actually was. This story isn't just about David and Emma. It's about all of us. Right now, as you're watching this, there are people around you who are struggling in silence. Maybe it's a coworker who always volunteers for overtime. Maybe it's a neighbor who you never see throw anything away. Maybe it's someone in your own family who smiles and says they're fine when you ask how they're doing. How often do we really look? How often do we see past the surface and notice when someone needs help? David could have ignored that simple request for leftover food. He could have approved it and moved on with his life. But he chose to pay attention. He chose to care. And that choice changed two lives, Emma's and his own. So here's my question for you. If you have the power to help someone, even in the smallest way, what are you waiting for? That coworker who seems tired all the time, maybe check in with them. That friend who never wants to go out anymore, maybe there's a reason. That employee who works harder than anyone else, maybe find out why. Because sometimes, the difference between someone just surviving and actually living isn't as big as we think. Sometimes it's just one person caring enough to really see what's right in front of them. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you have all the answers. If you can help someone today, do it today. Because you never know, you might just change everything.